Hi everyone, I'm Kate Kennedy and I'm here with day 30 of 100 Days of Kane, PA. And today we're going to talk with Barry Johnson. I know a lot of you guys in the previous interviews have heard Vern Johnson referenced a lot as someone who hired many of the teachers that we talked with. And Barry is his son and has some great stories to share about his dad, as well as his own days playing football in high school and in college. So I'm going to go ahead and flip you around and we're gonna walk on in. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks so much for talking with us today. So today, I was thinking we could first start by talking about your own experience. So you're a Kane High grad.
Yes.
What year did you graduate?
1969.
1969. So you just celebrated 50 years
Yes.
over Alumni Weekend.
Yes, indeed.
And you grew up, you were born and raised here in Kane.
Yes.
And your dad was Vern Johnson.
Yes, he was.
Would you mind talking about how he ended up as a superintendent, but would you start by sharing his history? Like, how did he even get to that position? Where did he begin?
His story begins in Wilcox, where he was one of two children born to his parents. He had an older brother, about 4 years older, and then my dad showed up in around 1923, I think. Went to Wilcox High School, played basketball there, really liked that. His basketball coach was a guy named Carl Peterson, known as Brick Peterson then, for his red hair and flaming hot temper. I should put that in there. It was a name, that's why he was Brick. But and after he left high school early to join the service for World War II, actually ended up getting his high school diploma from Virginia Military Institute, VMI, which is kind of unique around here.
Yeah, that's surprising. First of all, I was surprised that Wilcox even had a high school. I didn't know that.
Yeah, as did Mount Jewett back then.
Uh-huh. And
Yeah.
then, that he decided to leave high school to serve his country.
Right, he did. And he saw some service duties, not a lot of active fighting, but he was at the end of World War II. He put in his 2 years. After the war was over, he was discharged, of course. And it was after he was discharged that he had an encounter with someone who really changed his life. My dad was on a train home from the depot, wherever they were decommissioned. And on the train also was another kid from Wilcox, Norbert Powell, and Dr. Peterson, who at that time was a safety instructor for the Navy. He taught something called drown proofing, which basically amounts to an easy way to tread water and stay alive in the ocean until you can get picked up by another boat, hopefully.
Wow.
He was in charge of that for the entire Navy, which is a pretty big job at that time. Mm-hmm. So Norbert Powell and my father were both done with the service, headed back to Wilcox to spend their career there, working in the woods or in the tannery back then. And on the bus ride where they encountered Dr. Peterson, he asked them about their plans, and they said, "We're going to Wilcox, probably to work in the tannery or else cut wood." And Dr. Peterson said, "You guys are going to," he said, "You guys are going to college. You're going to go to Pitt." To which my dad replied, "The hell I am," followed directly by Brick Peterson, "The hell you're not." And Dr. Peterson actually put them in his own vehicle, drove them to the University of Pittsburgh, enrolled them as students, got them a room in the YMCA, which is where they both lived for 4 years, because Pitt was a commuter school, had no dormitories. And that's how my dad got started in his career.
That's amazing that an encounter with one person on the train changed the direction of his whole entire life.
Completely changed it. He would have been working in a factory in Wilcox or Johnsonburg or somewhere in a whole different setting. And this encounter with somebody knew my dad for a number of years and watched him grow up, and took enough initiative to see that my dad and Mr. Powell could have done a lot better, and then made it possible for him to do so.
Yeah, it took action on that.
Yes.
By driving them there and setting them up. That's amazing. So he was at Pitt, he graduated. What did he study at Pitt?
He studied teaching. He got a teaching certificate for high school. His first job was somewhere in Indiana County. I don't even remember the name of the town, which he hated because it wasn't home. He'd never been out of Wilcox except for joining the service, and he wanted to get back into this area. And after he had taught, I think, for 1 or 2 years in Indiana County, somehow Dr. Miller, Paul Miller, found out about him. Mr. Miller was a superintendent up here. Heard about my dad, went down to visit him, made him an offer to come to Kane, and made it possible for my dad to move here.
Wow.
That's how he ended up in Kane.
So Dr. Miller knew and remembered your dad, or had heard about your
I
dad.
heard about my dad.
Yeah.
Right. Very familiar with him. Made it a point to actually go down to Indiana County to see my dad and make him an offer down then, which my dad was really glad to get because he wanted to be closer to Kane and Wilcox. So they decided to move here. The next thing was to buy a house, so he sent my mother up to look at houses. She looked at 2 or 3 houses. Again, I'm like 2 years old at this stage, so I don't remember any of this, but they finally settled on a house on 7 South Tynesta, which they owned until they both died. Then they needed to go get a loan from the bank. One of the bankers, John Hill from Hill Kelly Funeral Home, remembered my dad from high school as a basketball player and said, sure, we'll give this guy a loan. Again, this is late 40s, maybe early 50s, so teaching income was pretty meager back then. A teacher buying a house was kind of a risky proposition. But somebody knew my dad from high school, watched him play, and said, sure, we'll give him the money for a house loan. Yeah, no problem.
Something that only in a small town could that have happened.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Because he wasn't even here. It was your mom that was here talking.
Yeah, my dad never even looked at the house. He had
Oh,
no
my
idea what it was. He just had enough faith in my mother that it would be a good house, and they made it into a great house.
Yeah. So they moved up to Kane, and he started teaching. What was he teaching?
His first teaching job was in junior high, was Pennsylvania history and civics, PA history and civics. Yeah, which was a course I took in 9th grade as well, so it was there a long time. Yeah.
And so he taught for how many years? Do you know how many years he was teaching?
I don't know how many years he was actually in the classroom. And then he was moved up to junior high principal, which happened about early 60s. Because he had been a junior high principal. He was there all 3 years when I went through. My sister had him for 3 years as junior high. My brother Bill had him for 2 years in junior high and 3 years as the high school principal. So he had like 5 years of lockdown. But he still managed to find a little way to get in trouble here and there. Pretty mild trouble.
Okay, so he served as a principal of the junior high and high school. And
Right.
then how did he move into the superintendent position?
Again, this is press reports. I'm not at these meetings, but I know what happened at the meeting. School board meeting, Mr. Miller announces his resignation. One of the board members nominates my dad for the job. Said we're not taking applications. I nominate Vern Johnson to be the superintendent. A unanimous vote followed quickly, and that was it.
Well, what a good decision, because he's made such a good, strong impact on so many people over his years as superintendent.
He spent like 35 years in the system, about, I think, 15 years as superintendent, somewhere like that. Until he retired in around 1985, somewhere. Around 1988, because he was superintendent when the tornado hit in 85.
Oh.
And so he got to rebuild a bunch of the buildings, and he made sure that was done before he retired.
Wow, yeah. And I think it's interesting because of how he got his job based on people just kind of knowing him and then believing in him. And then I've heard some of the teachers that we interviewed previously on 100 Days say, yep, he gave me a chance. I don't know why he hired me, but he gave me a chance. And they all ended up working out really, really well. So he really paid that forward. And it sounds like he was that way as a superintendent for students, too.
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that you get when you've been in a place for 35 years, you get a feel for people's background, what their parents are like, what their family's like, what they're capable of doing if things go well for them. And he was not at all afraid to hire people who were just fresh out of college, but had the right background, in his opinion, to become good teachers. And he hired a number of people like that. Some from Kane, some not from Kane.
Yeah. Will you tell about how he interacted with the kindergarteners? I think that's a neat story.
Well, again, he had a long career in Kane High School teaching, in the Kane system. So he knew a lot of kids because he taught them at one level. And then they would come back with bringing their own kids to school. And my dad would make a point to meet kindergarten kids, first day of school. Oh, yeah, you're so-and-so. I had your mom and dad in school. I hope you're better than they were because they were lazy. Or, I had your mom and dad in school. Your dad was a great kid. Your mom was wonderful. But he had a connection to almost every kid.
Yeah, and that's what's so
Every kid
neat.
that came in.
That's what's so neat about a small town too, is that if you're in a career long enough, you get to know the families and see generations go through, and that means something as a kid to know that your parents were known.
Well, it means something as a kid, especially if you're out of high school and applying to a college, and you ask for a letter of recommendation, and a lot of people write a letter of recommendation for students, and it's kind of a non-offensive letter. My dad would write a letter, and he would also oftentimes pick up a phone and call the director of admissions somewhere and say, take a look at this one. I highly recommend you take this kid, which is almost always followed by, yeah, we'll take him.
Yeah, well, what a difference he's made in so many lives. And then there's your mom. Your mom, I think, has such an interesting story. She, will you tell us, she was a teacher, but when did she go to school to become a teacher?
I was in 8th grade when my mother went back to school to become a teacher.
I think that's amazing.
She started 2 years. She did 2 years at Pitt Bradford, which is all they had available at the time. And then she transferred to Clarion for her final 2 years, which left my dad in charge of my 3 siblings and myself. So when my mother was home on weekends, she would spend the entire time making meals for 5 days and freezing them, and then going back to school on Monday.
What made her want to go to school in her late 30s or early 40s?
She'd always had a yearning to do something. For one thing, she was incredibly smart. She was a very smart lady. Just felt like she had so much to offer, and she just wanted to do something to help, and that was what she came up with, teaching.
And what did she start teaching?
She started as English, as an English teacher, and then an opening came up in the Spanish department, and she quickly became a very accomplished Spanish teacher.
Yes.
Very accomplished.
That's how I've heard of her.
Yeah.
And you were saying earlier that she had really high expectations for her students, and they really learned a lot, and it even impacted them in college sometimes.
She had a number of students who would exempt out of the foreign language requirement for college, which is, basically a year of a foreign language, which you get on your record already without having to pay anything for it.
Wow.
So you save money and you save a whole year's worth of time learning a language.
Yeah, and that just says a lot about her teaching skills.
Yeah, plus you have that language. Once you have it, it's easy to keep up with it.
That's right. Well, what about you? So you're 1969 Kane High grad, and did you play sports in high school?
Sure. I played sports. All my friends played sports. It's like the only thing there was. Well, there was choraleers and there were student class plays, but there weren't a lot of things like there are now. So sports was a huge part.
What sports did you play?
We had football in the fall, and then we had basketball in the winter, and then springtime was track season.
And you were talking earlier about some of the football players that you looked up to as a kid.
Well, the earliest one I remember is a kid named Ed Malmstrom, who played at Columbia University, just a tremendous football player, who then went on to become a very professional rugby player.
Oh.
Which is even crazier than football.
Yeah.
Like football without a helmet or pads. So.
Yes.
So he was the first one I remember. Then, of course, the one that everyone knows was Tim Montgomery, who was like the player of the year for Pennsylvania. Went on to become a big star at Penn State. That would have been around 1961 or 62. He was followed a couple years after that by John Kolka. Keep in mind, Tim Montgomery and John Kolka both became captains at Penn State. So not only were they talented, they were looked up to by their teammates and coaches. So they were really huge examples to follow. They were followed by Dave Rikeski and George Kolka. And then I went in 1969. My classmate Danny Beckwith, also 1969, had to go to prep school for a year because he had never thought about going to college, so he needed a little bit of background, which he got. And he came to Penn State, and then my youngest brother Bill came 2 years after I did. So that's 7 kids in a span of about 10 years.
That's amazing. What was it like for you when you got recruited, or when you decided to go play?
So everybody you get a recruit visit to a school. So I went and stayed in a dorm with, I think, George Kolka. Had 2 meals in the cafeteria, and ran into a problem because I didn't have a student ID and they weren't going to serve me. And Dave Rikeski finally said, "Look, he's a recruit. Just give him a damn meal, will you?" And went back and stayed in the dorm with those guys. No party, 0 dancing, nothing like that. Mm-hmm. Went to class with one. I went to George Kolka's engineering class, just for something to do on a Saturday afternoon. And but that stage, after 4 kids had already gone there, it was if you had a chance to go to Penn State, it was a no-brainer. Mm-hmm. You were going to go there.
Mm-hmm. And did any of the coaches come up to look at you guys when you were playing?
Yeah, there was the assistant coach named J.T. White, who was also my position coach at Penn State, who had been to the Rose Bowl twice, once with Michigan, and another time with Ohio State, interrupted by some time in the Korean War. So he has 2 Rose Bowl rings from 2 different schools. He had played at Michigan with, what is the guy's name? I can't think of his name, but he was like one of the premier running backs of college football. Harmon, his name was Harmon. Tom Harmon, like one of the all-time greats. He played at Michigan with Tom Harmon.
Wow.
So this guy was used to high-level athletics.
Mm-hmm.
So he was my position coach. He would actually go into my mom and dad's house and sit there till I got out of school or practice started, one or the other. And one occasion he told my dad, he took down some phone messages and had a beer from the refrigerator.
So he felt really comfortable.
Yeah, right at home. But they would actually show up at our practice. The Penn State coaches would actually show up there to watch practice, which is more than just a little pressure. Wanted to have a good day when they were watching.
Right.
But that's how I ended up at Penn State.
That's so neat. And I didn't realize before today that there were so many kids from Kane that went to Penn State.
7 kids in a 10-year span.
Wow.
It was incredible.
Yeah. That must have been great. And then Joe Paterno was the coach at the time.
Yes, he was.
Did he ever visit Kane?
He came here once for a sports boosters banquet in the spring. He was the main speaker. He was an excellent speaker. I mean, he had a sense of humor. He belittled my dad in front of the entire crowd, which was a lot of fun for me to watch. And he came up one other time when we had a benefit for Danny Beckwith, who had his ALS disease. Mm-hmm. And they had a benefit for him, which Joe came up in the middle of winter. It took him 2 different occasions to get here because he couldn't get up the one time. He couldn't get into Kane. So he came back. He had a packed house at the high school auditorium. Had a huge crowd and a tremendous turnout.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so neat. That's so neat that he came up here and that that other coaches were here watching football practice and investing in these kids here from Kane.
Yes.
I was gonna ask you. I had one more question in my head. I'll think of it. Okay. Is there anything else that you would like to share about your parents or about your time playing sports or your college experience or any other things about?
Well, I would just like to let people know the level of athletics that when I was in high school. I mean, Danny and I went to Penn State. My brother went to Penn State. We had a number of kids that go to the state colleges like IUP, and kids went to Alfred and played. So there was a lot of kids going. Kids from Warren were going to Penn State. A friend of mine from Bradford went to Purdue. A kid from Ridgeway and went to NC State. So there was college football all over the place around here. Mm-hmm. A lot of college players.
Yeah, and that says a lot about the sports in our high schools too, that people are then going on to play in college. So yeah, that's really great. So one of the things I do want to know, you were born here and then you came back here and you're still here. You raised your family here. You have your your grandkids here, and so
Yes.
what is it that you love about Kane? Why did you come back, and what do you love about this town?
I love a number of things about it. First of all, I was fortunate. I met my wife in high school. We went to Penn State together. She was gracious enough to marry me in 1973, 75. And I moved here looking for something to do. Her father was nice enough to hire me to work with him in the logging business, and I really, really enjoyed that. I never got to be that good at it, but I did enjoy it, and never wanted to leave. Never thought I'd do any better anywhere else.
Well-
That's why I'm here.
Well, and I think too that both your parents and your wife's parents, even after they were retired, chose to live in Kane, and you're doing the same thing.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I love it here. I've been here my entire life, just like all four of our parents were. I mean, I'm counting Wilcox as being the same as Kane.
Yeah.
I mean, 10 miles around here doesn't make much difference. We're up in the frozen part of northwest Pennsylvania, and, winters are kind of long and cold, but that's what we grew up with. That's what we're used to.
Yes, yes. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you'd like to share today?
I just like to thank some of my coaches, especially my high school coaches, Dick Smith in particular, and my high school basketball, track, and football coach, Bruce Rice.
Oh.
I mean, they made a lot of things happen for me. I got a lot of attention from those guys, sometimes more than I wanted. But it was a fantastic time to grow up in, a fantastic town, and there were some really, really excellent people around here.
Well, I was just thinking when we were talking, you said so many people through that 10-year span went to Penn State. What was the football record? Like, was the football team really good?
Tim Montgomery, who was the first kid to go to Penn State from here, was on Kane's first undefeated team.
Oh, the
They were
first one ever?
First one ever in the modern era. I mean, maybe in the 1910s there was one, but 1960 Kane was undefeated for the year, and he was the main reason. And then, of course, he led the parade to Penn State. Penn State had fantastic years during those years. Rip Engel was at the end of his coaching career. Joe Paterno was just starting as a head coach. It was a fantastic time to be in school, to be in college.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and we're glad that you stuck around Kane too.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
All right. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in today. It was really interesting to hear about how one person can make such a big difference in someone's life, and that Brick Peterson got Barry's dad into college, really changed the course of not just his life, but the lives of all the students that he eventually ended up impacting. And so I just hope that you feel inspired after hearing these stories today. And many of you probably know Vern and Phyllis Johnson or have memories of them. So if you do, please share them in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories too. So thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you tomorrow for day 31.